There is a place in the archives of St. Landry Parish, Louisiana, where the records simply stop. Not because nothing happened, not because the years were quiet. The 1840s and 1850s were some of the most violent, prosperous, and morally catastrophic decades in the history of that parish. The sugar harvest was booming, the auction markets were full, the plantation ledgers were fat with numbers that represented human beings reduced to line items. The records from that era are voluminous, meticulous, almost obsessive in their documentation of property, transaction, and profit. But there is a specific gap, a deliberate, carefully constructed silence wrapped around a name that should have filled pages, around a man who stood inside makeshift fighting rings 37 times and walked out of every single one while the men he fought did not, around a story so explosive, so dangerous to the system that produced it, that the people with the power to document history chose instead to bury it beneath the ordinary language of commerce and death. The newspapers never covered it, the court records contain no trace of it, the official ledgers of St. Landry Parish reference nothing that could be called a confession, a charge, or even a rumor with a name attached. What we have instead are fragments, a leather-bound journal kept by a plantation owner, some pages burned, the rest locked in a desk drawer for 28 years before his death, a letter found among a dead man's effects, written on the day Abraham Lincoln was shot, addressed to no one, signed by no one, soaked in guilt that had nowhere left to go. A Federal Writers Project interview from 1932, in which a 93-year-old woman describes what her grandmother told her about a man who changed everything. And the oral histories, carried in the mouths of descendants across 6 generations, passed from grandparents to children in quiet rooms where the weight of what was being said was understood even before all the words were learned. His name was Samuel. He had no last name in the documents because the documents treated him as property, and property does not carry a surname. The men who watched him fight called him the Bayou Giant. The enslaved workers who whispered about him in the dark used a different word altogether, one that translates roughly as the one who could not be broken. He was forced to fight 37 times. He won 37 times. 37 men died because of those victories, some in the ring, some in the days that followed, their bodies unable to survive what had been done to them. He killed those men not because he was cruel, not because he was bloodthirsty, not because the violence came naturally to him. He killed them because the alternative, refusing, would have meant watching the people he loved suffer consequences that no one should be forced to imagine. This is not a story about a fighter. This is a story about what one man chose to do with an impossible situation, about how he transformed 3 years of forced brutality into the most sophisticated act of resistance that plantation Louisiana had ever seen, about the secrets he gathered in those torchlit clearings, about the people he quietly freed, one at a time, through methods so careful and so patient that the men who owned him never fully understood what he was doing until it was already done. What you are about to hear comes from private journals, estate documents, oral histories, and testimonies that were deliberately hidden for over a century. Some of it has never been presented in this form before. Stay until the end, because the most important part of Samuel's story is not the fighting. It is what happened after the 37th fight, in a clearing on the edge of the Atchafalaya Basin, when everything that had been building for 3 years finally arrived, and the world that had tried so hard to break him discovered too late that it had made a catastrophic miscalculation. To understand what happened to Samuel, you first have to understand the world that made it possible. St. Landry Parish in 1847 was a machine. It did not look like one. From a distance, from the wide galleries of the plantation houses, from the shaded porch of a Oplauser's merchant, from the ornate dining rooms where planters entertained each other with French wine and practiced conversation, it looked like civilization. It had the forms of civilization: churches, courthouses, schools for the children of the wealthy, newspapers that covered commodity prices and political gossip and social events with equal earnestness. But beneath those forms, the machine ran on a single fuel: human beings, specifically the bodies of enslaved African men and women whose labor transformed the flat, humid, swamp-edged land of south-central Louisiana into one of the most productive sugar-growing regions on Earth. The numbers were not hidden. They appeared openly in the ledgers, in the sale records, in the auction advertisements that ran in the Oplauser's Courier every 3rd week. By 1847, enslaved people made up well over half the population of St. Landry Parish. They planted the cane and cut it. They fed the processing mills that ran day and night during harvest season, in conditions of heat so extreme that men sometimes collapsed and died at the machinery. They built the houses, cooked the food, raised the children of the families that owned them. They were the engine of everything. The men who owned that engine were, by the standards of their time and class, successful. Among the most successful was a third-generation planter named Charles Bogard Marchand. Marchand was 38 years old in the fall of 1847, and he had the particular confidence of a man who had never been seriously tested. His grandfather had bought the original land. His father had expanded it. Marchand himself had transformed the family's holdings into something that his peers could only describe, with a mixture of admiration and envy, as an empire. 3,000 acres of productive sugar land west of Oplausers. A processing operation that ran at full capacity from October through January. A workforce, the word the ledgers used, of more than 90 enslaved people. An annual income that placed him among the top tier of planters in the entire state. He was also, by the standards of any era, a man with a peculiar obsession. While his contemporaries bred racehorses or collected imported wines or cultivated elaborate gardens behind their plantation houses, Marchand had developed what he called, in his journal, an interest in physical competition. He attended boxing matches in New Orleans. He traveled to Mobile to watch bare-knuckle fights that drew wealthy crowds from across the Gulf South. He journeyed once to Charleston specifically to observe a celebrated fighter perform, and he returned with pages of notes that he treated with the same analytical care he gave to his sugar production records. He was a spectator who had outgrown spectatorship. He wanted to own the fighter. In September of 1847, a slave ship arrived in New Orleans carrying human cargo from the Carolinas. Among those sold at auction in the days that followed was a man listed in the sale document simply as Samuel, approximately 24 years of age, of exceptional size and constitution. The description noted his height at 6 feet 4 inches, extraordinary for the era. His weight at approximately 230 pounds, most of it muscle developed through years of plantation labor. His condition described as excellent, despite difficult handling. That last phrase was a commercial euphemism. What it meant was that Samuel had already been sold 3 times in 4 years. He had cost each previous owner significant money and produced for them nothing but frustration. The bill of sale included a handwritten notation that had frightened off every other serious bidder. Strong-willed, requires firm management. Charles Bogard Marchand read that notation and smiled. He paid $800, nearly double the going rate for an enslaved man of comparable physical condition. The other planters at the auction thought him a fool, and they said so with the comfortable frankness of men who assume their opinions are the world's truth. He'd bought a problem, they told him. He'd overpaid for trouble. What none of them understood was that Marchand wasn't buying a field hand. He was buying a weapon, and he already knew exactly how he intended to use it. The Marchand plantation sat 7 miles west of Oplausers, accessible by a road that became impassable mud whenever the Louisiana sky decided to open, which was often. The main house was a 2-story structure of white-painted wood, wide galleries wrapping both floors, shuttered windows designed to catch whatever faint movement of air might relieve the suffocating heat of the interior. Behind it, the infrastructure of the operation spread outward, the sugar field stretching to the horizon in neat, geometrical rows, the processing mill with its permanent smell of boiling cane juice, the overseer's cottage, the quarters, long, low structures of rough timber where the enslaved workers lived in conditions that tested the word shelter to its absolute limit. Samuel arrived in the first week of October. He was assigned to the stables, which confused everyone on the property who understood how such things worked. Stable work was reserved for the tractable, for men who had accepted their situation, who had learned, through whatever combination of persuasion and pain their previous owners had employed, to suppress whatever inner life they possessed and perform the role of contented labor. Samuel was the opposite of tractable. Everyone on the plantation could see it immediately, not in any act of explicit defiance, but in something more fundamental, the way he carried himself, the quality of his stillness. The sense, unmistakable once noticed, that behind his eyes a separate and entirely intact consciousness was observing everything and drawing conclusions. Marchand noticed it too, and for 3 weeks he did nothing except watch. He watched Samuel work. He noted the economy of movement, the controlled power in every task, the way his body seemed to operate at some fraction of its actual capacity, as though he was perpetually holding something in reserve. He studied his interactions with the other enslaved workers, guarded at first. then gradually opening, small gestures of recognition and connection forming between Samuel and a handful of people. A woman named Dinah who worked in the kitchen. An older man called Silas, who had been on the plantation for 20 years and knew every path, every protocol, every unspoken rule. A boy of perhaps 10, Marcus, who had appointed himself Samuel's unofficial shadow and could not be discouraged from following him around the stables whenever his own assigned work permitted. Marchand watched all of this with the careful attention of a man who was not just admiring an asset, but conducting reconnaissance. He found what he was looking for on an October afternoon that had started as an ordinary day and became anything but. An overseer named Dutch Keller, a man whose cruelty was regarded even among his peers as excessive, a man who used his authority less for the management of labor and more for the indulgence of something dark that lived in him, decided to assert himself. The specific pretext was never recorded. It didn't matter. With men like Keller, the pretext was always irrelevant. What mattered was the opportunity to demonstrate, to himself as much as to anyone watching, that his power was absolute and could be exercised without consequence. He raised his whip. The arc of his arm was practiced. He had done this many times. Samuel caught his wrist. Not violently, not with the explosive force that everyone present might have expected, with a grip so certain, so utterly without hesitation, that it seemed less like an act of physical resistance and more like a statement of fact. This will not happen. The entire plantation held its breath. What should have happened next was straightforward. Samuel should have been dragged to the whipping post. He should have been made an example so severe that no one on the property would ever again entertain the thought of raising a hand against their overseer. The logic of the system demanded it. Resistance left unanswered was resistance that grew. Instead, Charles Marchand walked out of the main house. He looked at the scene for perhaps 3 seconds, then he told Keller to leave. The overseer protested, insisted, made the argument that discipline had to be maintained, that the whole operation depended on clear hierarchies, that what Marchand was doing undermined everything. He was not entirely wrong by the logic of the system he served. Marchand repeated himself, and the second time the tone made further argument not just unwelcome but dangerous. Keller left, furious and humiliated. He would not forgive it. Marchand turned to Samuel. In the journal entry he wrote that evening, the first entry that mentions Samuel by name, he recorded the exchange that followed with unusual precision, as if he understood that the moment was worth documenting carefully. I told him I knew what he was. I told him I understood that he could not be broken and that I had no intention of trying. Then I told him I had an offer to make. The offer was simple. It was also, depending on how you understood the word, monstrous. The offer was this: Samuel would fight. Not for his freedom, Marchand was not yet ready to make that concession. Not for money, Samuel would receive no payment. He would fight because Marchand had arranged for enslaved fighters to compete against each other for the entertainment and profit of the planter class, and Samuel was going to be his entry into that enterprise. In return, Dinah, Silas, and Marcus would be protected, not freed, not yet, but shielded from the worst of the plantation's violence, extra rations, freedom from the fieldwork that destroyed bodies before their time, protection from men like Keller. If Samuel won, these people would be spared. If he lost or refused, Marchand was equally precise about the consequences. Dinah would be sold to the worst operation he could find, and he named several because he wanted Samuel to understand that the threat was specific rather than abstract. Silas would be handed to Keller with explicit permission to do as he pleased. Marcus, the boy, would be sent somewhere that Marchand described with enough clinical detail to make very clear that he had thought it through. This was the architecture of the bargain, not violence used to compel, but the threat of violence directed at others, at people Samuel had, despite every effort to prevent it, come to care about. Marchand had spent 3 weeks studying him not just to assess his fighting potential, but to identify his vulnerabilities, and he had found them. Samuel's greatest strength, his capacity to form genuine human connections, even under conditions designed to make such connections impossible, was the exact thing Marchand intended to use against him. Samuel listened to all of it without expression. When Marchand finished, there was a silence that the journal describes as lasting nearly a full minute. Then Samuel said yes. He did not say yes because he was broken. He was not broken. He said yes because he understood, with the kind of intelligence that operates beyond emotion in the cold, clear space where survival calculations are made, that this was not yet the moment to refuse. That refusal without a strategy was just another form of destruction, that the people who had been offered to him as levers were real people with real lives that he had over 3 weeks allowed himself to care about. And that caring about them was not a weakness to be eliminated, but a responsibility to be honored. He said yes, and he immediately began planning for the day when the conditions of the yes would no longer apply. The first fight was arranged for the 14th of November, 1847, in a clearing 3 miles from the plantation house. Marchand had spent the weeks between the agreement and the fight reaching out through the network of wealthy planters that constituted his social world, letting it be known, carefully and in the right ears, that he had acquired something worth seeing. 15 men gathered that evening. Each brought his own enslaved fighter. Each arrived confident that his man would prove superior. The clearing had been prepared with the rough efficiency that such occasions demanded. Underbrush cleared, torches driven into the soft ground at intervals, a rough perimeter established. The rules were recited with the practiced brevity of men who regarded the formality as theater. Fighters would compete until one could no longer continue. No weapons, no interference. The winner's owner collected a purse contributed by all participants. Samuel's opponent was a man named Jupiter, the property of a planter named Etienne Roussel. Jupiter had fought 3 times before and won each contest. He was perhaps 6 years older than Samuel, 30, with the particular build of a man who had been trained to fight rather than simply forced into it, and with scars distributed across his face and torso that documented his previous work with the blunt accuracy of a resume. Roussel had brought him specifically to humiliate Marchand, to demonstrate that the newcomer's confidence was the overconfidence of a man who didn't yet understand how these things worked. The fight began just after sunset. What happened over the next 17 minutes would define everything that followed. Samuel moved with a quality that the men watching had not expected and struggled to describe in the letters and journal entries some of them wrote afterward. It was not just power, though the power was extraordinary. It was not just size, though he was one of the largest men any of them had seen. It was a quality of calculation, each strike placed with the precision of a man who had already thought 3 moves ahead. Each defensive adjustment made before the attack had fully developed. Jupiter was skilled and experienced and genuinely dangerous, and he landed blows that opened cuts above Samuel's eyes and cracked ribs and would have dropped a lesser man without hesitation. Samuel did not drop. He absorbed punishment with an equanimity that seemed to the watching crowd almost inhuman, not because he didn't feel it, but because he had developed, through some process no one watching could quite identify, the ability to continue operating through pain that would disable other men. Jupiter fought with increasing desperation as the fight progressed, throwing combinations that were more powerful than calculated, trying to find the mechanism that would make Samuel stop. He never found it. The fight ended when Jupiter collapsed. His body had simply exhausted its capacity to continue, even as his will had not. He was carried from the ring by 2 men who struggled with his weight. The plantation doctor who examined him later that night recorded severe trauma to the head and torso and noted the condition as critical. Jupiter died 4 days later. The official cause was listed as fever. Samuel stood in the center of the ring, blood running freely down his face and chest, and waited for permission to leave. Marchand collected his winnings, nearly $200, and afterward pulled Samuel aside. The exchange was brief. Marchand asked one question: "Can you do that again?" Samuel's answer was 4 words: "As many times as necessary." If the first fight created the foundation, the next 18 months built the structure. Samuel fought 11 more times between November of 1847 and the spring of 1849. Each fight followed the same essential pattern: wealthy planters gathering in secret locations with their enslaved fighters, money wagered, violence performed. The winners celebrated while the losers were carried away in whatever condition the evening had left them. The locations rotated, a clearing here, a barn there, once the backfield of a plantation whose owner had mortgaged his cane crop to cover his entry fee. The crowds grew as word spread through the close social network of the planter class, a network maintained through letters and visits, and the kind of conversation that happens when men of money gather to talk about money. Of Samuel's 11 opponents in that period, 8 died, some in the ring, others in the days that followed, their bodies discovering in the quiet aftermath what the violence had truly cost them. The 3 who survived were left with injuries comprehensive enough that their owners, facing the brutal arithmetic of the slave economy, sold them at fractions of their original value to buyers too desperate to care about broken men. Marchand kept records with the meticulous precision of a man who understood that this enterprise was, despite its setting and its cruelty, fundamentally a business. His leather-bound journal noted each opponent by name, each fight's duration, each purse won, each side bet collected. He tracked Samuel's diet and training, his weight, his physical condition before and after each contest. He reinvested the proceeds with the same strategic intelligence he applied to his sugar operation, buying additional land, expanding his workforce, acquiring new processing equipment. Within 18 months, the money generated by Samuel's fists had accelerated the growth of the Marchand plantation by years. But the money was only one dimension of what was happening. Something else was developing in those weeks between fights, something that Marchand was too focused on his ledgers to observe clearly. Samuel was becoming a presence that extended beyond the plantation's official social geography. The other enslaved workers watched him depart for these mysterious overnight excursions. They watched him return days later with injuries that should have been debilitating and somehow were not. They noticed the space that formed around him, the overseer's careful distance, the way even Keller, who had never in his professional life given any enslaved person a wider berth than the absolute minimum, now found reasons to be in other parts of the property when Samuel was about. Rumors developed with the organic creativity of communities that process their world through story. Samuel was blessed. Samuel was cursed. Samuel had made a bargain with something that existed beyond the ordinary world. The details shifted with each telling, but the essential claim remained constant. Here was a man who had found a way to be inviolable, a man whom the system had tried to destroy and failed. To some, this was a source of awe. To others, something more dangerous. Hope. If you're watching this for the first time, welcome to Hollow Century. This channel exists to uncover the stories that were deliberately buried, the histories that those in power needed you never to hear. If what we're building here matters to you, subscribe right now and ring the notification bell. We drop new hidden histories every week, and you don't want to miss what's coming. Now back to Samuel. The 20th fight, on April 23, 1849, was the first time Samuel appeared to be in genuine danger. His opponent's name was Cato. He belonged to a planter named James Wesley Thorne, who had relocated from Georgia the previous year and brought Cato specifically as his entry into the fighting circuit that had developed across the region. Thorne had spent months building his fighter's reputation through strategic conversation, mentioning him in passing in the right company, allowing the number 6 to circulate as the count of men Cato had killed before the Georgia departure. By the time April arrived, the purse for the fight stood at $500, an extraordinary sum, and more than 40 planters had gathered at a designated clearing near Croix Springs with side bets that pushed the total wagered beyond $1,000. Cato was everything Thorne had promised. He was powerful in a way that was immediately and obviously different from the men Samuel had faced before, not just in physical strength, which was exceptional, but in technique. Someone had taught him. Someone who understood boxing as a discipline rather than simply licensed violence had spent significant time with Cato, drilling into him the mechanics of how to systematically dismantle an opponent. He fought with a structural intelligence, targeting Samuel's already damaged left eye from the first exchanges, working the ribs with combinations designed to accumulate damage rather than score a single devastating blow, aiming at joints weakened by 2 years of constant fighting. For the first 15 minutes, the crowd began to believe they were finally going to see what they had come to see, not just another Samuel victory, but a genuine contest. Cato had opened a cut above Samuel's left eye severe enough to impair his vision. He had staggered Samuel twice with strikes to the temple. He had clearly broken something in Samuel's ribcage, the impact audible across the clearing, and watched Samuel drop to one knee. Thorne was already beginning the language of celebration. Marchand's face had gone pale. Samuel stood back up. What happened next was documented in no fewer than 5 separate journals and letters written by men who were present that evening, and their accounts align in every detail that matters. Samuel did not simply continue fighting, he changed. The methodical approach that had characterized all 39 previous fights, the calculation, the patience, the 3 moves ahead intelligence, gave way to something else entirely. Not rage, precisely, but something that operated beyond the normal constraints of pain and strategy and self-preservation. He walked through Cato's remaining strikes as though they were happening to someone else, and responded with a violence that did not seem limited by the physical damage he was carrying. The fight ended in the 23rd minute. Samuel landed a blow to Cato's temple that everyone in the clearing heard as a distinct terminal sound. Cato was dead before he fell. The night went absolutely still, not the theatrical silence of a crowd waiting for the next thing to happen, but the genuine, unnerved quiet of men who had just witnessed something they did not have the language to process. Samuel stood over Cato's body and looked up at the crowd, and several men who had attended bare-knuckle fights across 3 states and prided themselves on their composure, took an involuntary step backward. On the journey back to the plantation, Marchand finally broke the silence that had accompanied them since leaving the clearing. He said what had been in his mind since the 16th minute of the fight: "You could have ended it sooner. You were playing with him." Samuel did not answer immediately. When he did, his voice was quiet and entirely steady. "I was teaching him something, and everyone who watched." "What were you teaching?" "That I cannot be beaten." Marchand recorded in his journal that night that something in those 3 words, not what they claimed, but the quality with which they were delivered, the perfect absence of boasting or emotion or anything that suggested the speaker needed the listener's belief, made him uneasy in a way he could not articulate. He had wanted Samuel to be undefeatable. That was, after all, the entire enterprise. But there was a difference, he wrote, between a man who won and a man who chose the moment of victory with the deliberateness of a teacher making a point to a class. The question that kept him awake until the pre-dawn hours was simple and had no comfortable answer: who was the class? The fight with Cato moved through the informal communication networks of enslaved Louisiana with extraordinary speed. These networks existed entirely outside the awareness of the men who owned the people who used them. They operated through the rhythms of the plantation economy itself, through enslaved workers traveling between properties to perform skilled labor, through kitchen workers exchanging information with enslaved people from neighboring plantations during the logistics of social events that the planter class held for themselves, through the simple geography of quarters where people lived in proximity and shared the news of their lives with the fundamental human need to bear witness to each other's existence. What traveled through these networks was not a fight report. It was something more significant. It was evidence of a proposition that the entire system of chattel slavery had been constructed to make unthinkable, that an enslaved man could be in some essential and ineradicable sense free, not legally, not materially, but in the particular way that mattered most in a system designed to eliminate everything that freedom meant: the survival of an inner self that the system could not access, could not damage, could not own. Samuel had beaten 20 men and the story became 30. He had survived injuries that should have killed him, and the story became that the injuries had not touched him at all. The embellishments were not corruption. They were translation, the conversion of a specific story into a universal truth. The people who passed the story along understood that its value was not documentary. Its value was the thing it proved possible. Marchand began receiving letters from planters across Louisiana and into Mississippi and Texas, all expressing variations of the same request. They wanted to see Samuel fight. They wanted their own fighters measured against the standard he had established. They wanted to be present when the legend was either confirmed or broken. The language of the letters was the language of business, of entertainment, of competition between wealthy men. But underneath it ran something more anxious, a need to know whether what they'd heard was real, because if it was, the implications extended beyond one man's fighting record into territory they were not prepared to examine. Marchand accepted challenges selectively, always negotiating for higher stakes, always extracting maximum value from each event. Between April 1849 and September 1850, Samuel fought 12 more times, 12 victories, 10 additional deaths. The 2 survivors were sold at devastated prices by owners who now possessed large, damaged men whose fighting careers and labor value had been simultaneously eliminated. What no one who organized these events fully understood, what Marchand himself did not understand, despite his proximity to Samuel throughout, was the education that was happening in those clearing hours before and after the fights. Samuel was listening. The wealthy men who gathered to watch him fight talked in his presence with the casual frankness of people who have never had to consider whether those around them might understand what they're saying, might be paying attention, might be filing information for future use. They discussed their business operations with the intimacy of men who had come together for entertainment and left their professional caution at home. They complained about competitors, described financial arrangements, named their bankers and their factors and their business partners in New Orleans and Baton Rouge. They outlined the geography of the regional economy with a specificity that no official document would ever replicate. And Samuel, standing silent at the edge of the ring in the minutes before each fight, absorbing all of it through the particular quality of attention that belongs to people who have learned to gather information from environments that are simultaneously public and hostile. Samuel remembered every word. He was not just building a fighting record, he was building a map of exactly how the system worked, who controlled what, where the pressure points were, and where the cracks might be found if someone applied the right kind of patient, careful, invisible force. 3 years into his tenure on the Martian plantation, the most dangerous man in St. Landry Parish was not a planter, not an overseer, not a politician, and not a soldier. He was a man who had been purchased for $800 and assigned to stable work, and everything his owner thought he knew about him was wrong. You're watching Hollow Century, where the history they tried to erase lives on. If this story is hitting differently than what you usually watch, that's intentional. Leave a comment right now telling us what state or city you're listening from and tell us, did you know any of this existed? Your engagement is what keeps this channel going and what gets the algorithm to show these stories to more people who need to hear them. Subscribe if you haven't yet. We're just past the halfway point, and what comes next changes everything. By October of 1850, Marchand's plantation had become one of the most profitable operations in the parish. The money from Samuel's fights had been reinvested with such consistent intelligence that observers attributing the growth purely to sugar revenue were left unable to fully account for the numbers. Marchand had built a new wing onto the main house. He'd imported furniture from France. He'd sent his oldest son to study in New Orleans. Success had done what success always does to men who have not been seriously tested. It had made him careless. The 32nd fight was scheduled for October 19th on a plantation near New Iberia. The opponent was a man named Caesar, belonging to a planter named Vincent Lafremise, who was known even within a society built on systematic brutality as a man whose cruelty exceeded what the economy actually required. He had gone through 7 enslaved fighters before Caesar, each one discarded when they could no longer serve his purposes, the disposal as casual as throwing away broken equipment. Caesar himself had survived 4 previous fights. He had killed 3 opponents and permanently disabled a 4th. The purse stood at $750. More than 50 spectators gathered, the largest crowd Samuel had faced to that point. Several had mortgaged property to cover their wages. The atmosphere was the particular kind of electric that only occurs when men with too much to lose have already committed to the bet. The fight lasted 31 minutes. Caesar fought with the specific desperation of a man who understood that defeat was not just defeat, it was the end, one way or another, of whatever life he had managed to construct under the conditions given to him. He was skilled and powerful and entirely committed to surviving this encounter at any cost. He was also, by any objective measure, outmatched not in size or strength, which were roughly comparable, but in the 31 fights worth of accumulated knowledge that Samuel brought to the ring each time. The fight ended when Caesar fell and did not rise. The plantation doctor confirmed what everyone already knew. What happened next was not in any plan and could not have been predicted. An enslaved man named Benjamin, brought to the fight by his owner, a planter named Collier, stepped forward from the group of enslaved workers who had been forced to attend for logistical purposes. He walked to the edge of the ring, past several overseers who moved to intercept him, and then stopped for no reason any of them could afterward adequately explain, and he looked directly at Samuel. How many? Benjamin asked. The question required no additional context. Samuel answered without hesitation, 32. Benjamin held his gaze for another moment, and you still hear. It was 4 words. It took perhaps 3 seconds. The overseers recovered themselves and moved to separate them. The moment was over before it had fully arrived. But every enslaved person at that clearing who witnessed the exchange understood what had just happened. The question was not about the fights. The question was about something the fight record represented, a proof repeating and compounding with every entry in the ledger that the system was not absolute, that it could be faced directly, continuously, under the worst conditions imaginable, and failed to destroy the person it was aimed at. Samuel left the ring, and as he passed the group of enslaved workers, several of them met his eyes, a direct gaze that would under normal circumstances have resulted in punishment. The gesture was deliberate and the meaning was clear. We see you. We understand what you're doing. We are with you in it." On the journey back to his plantation, Marchand said something in his journal that he had not said before: "This needs to stop." He knew somewhere beneath the calculations and the rationalized language of his ledger entries that something had been set in motion that extended far beyond his original intentions. He had wanted a fighting champion. He had built something else entirely, something he could feel gathering weight and momentum in the dark spaces of the parish that his authority did not reach. He could sense it without being able to name it. Something that used the shape of his enterprise as its container, but had long since outgrown any definition he could apply. He told Samuel on the ride home that he intended to stop arranging fights. Samuel, seated in the wagon bed with his hands bound, a precaution Marchand had recently instituted after noticing the way other enslaved workers tracked Samuel's movements, said nothing. But of course, it wasn't up to Marchand anymore. It hadn't been for some time. The problem with creating a legend is that legends do not belong to their creators. The other planters who had built their social capital around their association with Samuel's fights, who had won significant money, established profitable business connections, and elevated their standing in the regional hierarchy through their participation in the enterprise, had no interest in seeing it end on Marchand's timeline. They applied pressure through the exact mechanisms that governed relationships between wealthy men in the antebellum South, through business arrangements that could be complicated, through credit relationships that could be tightened, through the dense network of social obligation that made cooperation the effective price of participation in the planter class. Marchand, who had built much of his expanded operation on those exact relationships, found that the leverage ran in multiple directions. The fights continued. Fight 33 against a man named Prometheus, 12 minutes, dead. Fight 34 against a man named Atlas, 19 minutes, dead. Fight 35 against a man named Hannibal, 27 minutes, dead. The names of Samuel's opponents were increasingly classical, a fashion among planters who fancied themselves heirs to Rome, who named the people they owned after ancient warriors and gods with no apparent awareness, or perhaps with complete awareness and no care, of the irony. Each fight added another entry to the ledger. Each victory added another story to the ones already circulating through the parish. In his journal entries from November and December of 1850, Marchand's handwriting, always precise before, began to show signs of pressure. On November 23rd, he wrote, "The fights have become something I no longer control. Samuel wins as he always does, but there is a quality to these victories that troubles me. He is not simply defeating his opponents. He is sending a message, to whom I cannot say with certainty, but the message is being received." On December 8th, received word that 3 enslaved workers on the Rousel plantation attempted to resist their overseer, invoking Samuel's name as justification. The situation was resolved with the usual measures, but it demonstrates a problem I had failed to anticipate when I began this enterprise. On January 14th, 1851, I have decided that the 36th fight will be the last. I will make this announcement to the other planters and close this chapter of my affairs permanently. He never made the announcement, because on January 19th, something happened that accelerated every timeline and made certain that the story would not end the way any of them had planned. A young overseer named Thomas Gaines, new to the property, eager to establish his authority, with the specific recklessness of men who have studied the forms of power without understanding its actual mechanics, decided that Samuel had been given too many privileges. He found him near the stables and demanded that he perform some immediate menial task, the nature of which was less important than the performance of authority the demand was meant to accomplish. Samuel explained, calmly and without aggression, that he had been given specific instructions by Marchand to rest before an upcoming fight. Gaines struck him with a riding crop. Samuel turned and walked away toward the main house. He did not raise his voice. He did not retaliate. He simply turned and walked. Gaines pursued him, shouting, the riding crop raised again. Marchand emerged from the house at exactly the wrong moment, or, depending on how you read what followed, exactly the right one. He assessed the scene instantly and ordered Gaines to stand down. Gaines, too invested in the confrontation to retrieve his judgment, turned on his employer and made a series of statements that the 7 witnesses present later refused to repeat in full, but which apparently combined a challenge to Marchand's authority with the suggestion that his treatment of Samuel had created a dangerous and unstable situation on the property. Marchand fired him on the spot. Gaines left with a parting statement that every witness remembered perfectly. "You've created something you cannot control, and when it turns on you, don't say you weren't warned." That evening, Marchand sat in his study with his journal open and wrote one sentence: Gaines was right. He did not stop the 36th fight. The 36th fight was held February 2nd, 1851 on a plantation near Bro Bridge. The opponent was a man named Goliath, and one feels, reading the accounts, that whoever had given him that name had either a very dark sense of humor or a very limited imagination, because the man described in the documents was, by any measure, extraordinary. 6 feet 6 inches tall, 250 pounds. He had killed 4 previous opponents through a combination of reach, power, and a particular technique that his owner, Austin Baudrot, had spent 5 years developing through a program of deliberate physical conditioning that the surviving records describe with an enthusiasm that becomes more disturbing the more closely you read it. More than 70 spectators gathered. The purse exceeded $1,000. Side bets pushed the total wagered to more than $5,000, a sum that represented more than most Louisiana families would see in 5 years. For the first time since Jupiter, Samuel was genuinely challenged. Goliath's reach was a problem that Samuel's 35 previous fights had not required him to solve. The man's arms were longer than anything Samuel had encountered, and Baudrot had trained him to use that advantage systematically, keeping Samuel at distance, targeting his already compromised left eye from a range where return strikes couldn't reach, working the damaged ribs that had never fully healed from the Cato fight with combinations designed to accumulate until the structure failed. The fight lasted 42 minutes, the longest yet by a distance. Both men operated in the final 15 minutes in a state that went beyond normal human endurance, on whatever reserve of will exists in people who have been given no acceptable alternative to survival. The crowd had gone silent, not the theatrical silence of spectators performing their appreciation of drama, but the genuine quiet that falls when people are watching something that has exceeded the category of entertainment and entered the territory of something they will need to think about for a long time afterward. Samuel ended it with a combination that dropped Goliath to his knees, followed by a single final strike, whose sound the attending doctor later described in his notes as catastrophic in implication. Goliath fell forward and did not move. Samuel stood in the center of the ring, swaying, his left eye entirely closed, blood covering most of his face and torso. When he turned to look at the crowd, something in his expression, not triumph, not satisfaction, but a quality of awareness so complete and so unsparing that several men found they could not hold the gaze, produced the same involuntary backward step that had first appeared after the Cato fight and had never fully disappeared since. Marchand collected the winnings. Then he approached Samuel and said with a quietness that the nearby witnesses strained to hear that they were done. "No more fights. Final answer this time." Samuel's response was barely audible over the sounds of the dispersing crowd. "One more, 37. I need one more." Marchand wanted to refuse. The journal entry for that night records the conflict with uncharacteristic emotional transparency. He looked into Samuel's eyes and understood that this was not a request he was being asked to consider. It was a statement of fact. The 37th fight would happen with or without Marchand's sanction. The only question was whether Marchand would be part of it. He asked the only question that seemed to matter: why 37? Samuel's answer, recorded in the journal in handwriting that presses noticeably harder into the page than the entries surrounding it, was simple: because that's how many it takes. Marchand wrote that he never recorded what he believed that meant. Perhaps he didn't want to know. Perhaps he already knew, and what he didn't want was to confirm it in the permanence of written language. There would be a 37th fight. The final fight was arranged for March 17, 1851. The location was kept secret until the day itself, a clearing on the edge of the Atchafalaya Basin, accessible only through narrow channels that wound through swampland thick enough to swallow any sound, any evidence, any inconvenient witness. The secrecy was not just theatrical. Law enforcement officials had begun making inquiries. Too many deaths recorded as fever or accident in the same general geography. Too many rumors circulating through the wrong channels. The fights had always operated in the shadow of illegality, but they had operated there safely as long as the men who could have prosecuted them were the same men who attended them. That equation was shifting. The opponent for the 37th fight was a man named Ajax. Leopold Crane, a planter of recent wealth and aggressive ambition, had spent 18 months searching for him. He had traveled to the Caribbean specifically, following leads through a network of traders and fight organizers that spanned 3 islands, looking for a man he believed could finally end Samuel's streak. He found Ajax and paid $2,000 for him, an almost unthinkable sum plus arrangements for profitable future business with the men who brokered the sale. Ajax had killed 9 men across 3 different island fights. He arrived at the Louisiana clearings in chains, a precaution Crane insisted upon, and he was everything the records promised: 6 feet 7 inches tall, built with the specific, conditioned power of a man who had been trained for exactly this purpose, his face carrying the documentation of previous fights in permanent scar tissue. His eyes in the accounts carried something specific, not rage, not fear, but a kind of resigned, precise focus. He had survived this long by being very good at the thing he was being forced to do, and he intended to survive it again. But there was a second plan operating beneath the official surface of the 37th fight, a plan that Samuel did not know about when he agreed to come, a plan that Martian did not know about until the morning of March 17th, when it was almost too late for the knowledge to do anything except clarify the choice he was facing. Crane had made arrangements with several other planters, among them a man named Harrison Talbot, who had lost significant money wagering against Samuel over the previous year, and had reached the conclusion that the problem was not his judgment but Samuel's continued existence. Together they had agreed on a simple resolution: if Ajax could not defeat Samuel inside the ring, Samuel would not leave the clearing alive. Armed overseers had been positioned around the perimeter. Rifles had been distributed. The escape routes through the swamp channels had been blocked. The clearing on the edge of the Atchafalaya Basin was not just a fight venue, it was a trap. The intelligence that saved Samuel's life came through a chain of communication that perfectly illustrates both the sophistication of enslaved people's information networks and the fundamental human courage that such networks required. An enslaved woman named Patience, belonging to a cousin of Talbot's, overheard the conspiracy being arranged late the night before the fight. She understood enough of what she heard to know that it constituted a death sentence for a specific man. She found a way to pass the information to her sister, who worked in a kitchen on a neighboring plantation. Her sister traveled before dawn to reach Dinah on the Martian property. Dinah found a way, during the organized chaos of departure preparations, when dozens of people were moving in every direction, to press a folded scrap of brown paper into Martian's hand. The message was 6 words: they mean to kill him no matter what. Marchand read it. He stood in the morning of March 17th on the edge of a choice that would define his character more completely than any other moment in his life, and he understood that both obvious options were wrong. He could stay silent, preserve his business relationships, his credit lines, his social standing, let events proceed as the conspirators intended. He had been complicit in creating this situation from its beginning, had spent 3 years benefiting from Samuel's forced violence, had built his prosperity on 36 deaths. One more death, quietly accomplished in a swamp that kept secrets well, would not technically change the moral calculus by much. This was the logic available to him. It was the same logic he had been living with for 3 years. Or he could warn Samuel, which would destroy his relationships with the most powerful men in his social world, which would create enemies who had the means to make his business life genuinely difficult, which would expose him to potential legal scrutiny for his own role in 3 years of illegal fighting operations. He chose neither of those options. He went directly to Samuel and told him everything. They stood near the clearing's edge in the morning fog, the swamp pressing in around them, alive with the specific sounds of a Louisiana morning, the calls of herons in the shallows, the distant splash of something large moving in the dark water. Marchand showed Samuel the note. He named the conspirators, described their positions, explained where the armed men were stationed and what their instructions were. Samuel listened without interrupting. When Marchand finished, the silence stretched long enough for the morning sounds of the swamp to fill the space between them. Then Samuel asked his question, not about himself, not about the 37th fight or what it meant or whether there was a way out of the trap. He asked, the people you promised to protect, Dinah, Silas, Marcus, will they be safe? Marchand said yes, and he meant it in a way that surprised him with its completeness. 3 years of forced proximity to something he had tried to own had produced, against every intention, something that resembled genuine moral responsibility. I will make certain of it. Samuel nodded, processed, then he turned toward the ring. Marchand reached for him, physically reached for his arm, and said that they could leave, that he had money, that he could arrange passage on a ship from New Orleans before the conspirators understood what was happening, that this did not have to end here. Samuel looked at the hand on his arm, then at Marchand, with an expression that the journal describes as carrying a patience so complete it was almost terrifying. "You cannot run from a system by leaving it," he said. "You change it by going all the way through." He walked into the clearing. This is the moment the story has been building toward, and you're exactly where you need to be to understand what comes next. Hollow Century exists to tell the stories that the powerful tried to bury forever. If you've watched this far and felt something shift in how you understand this period of American history, share this video right now with someone who needs to see it. And stay, because the final act of Samuel's story contains something that no amount of retelling has ever quite done justice. By midday, more than 80 spectators had gathered in the clearing on the edge of the Atchafalaya Basin. They represented wealth and power drawn from across Louisiana and into Mississippi and Texas. Several had traveled for days. The total wagered in-person side bets combined exceeded $5,000, enough to purchase a small plantation outright or establish a substantial commercial operation in New Orleans. The atmosphere was wrong in a way that most of those present could sense, but none could precisely name. The conversation was subdued for a gathering of this nature. Men checked weapons they had ostensibly brought for protection during the journey through dangerous swamp territory, and checked them again with a frequency that implied other purposes. The tension that ran through the crowd was not just the anticipatory tension of an audience waiting for a performance. It was something more structural, the tension of a plan that could go wrong in multiple directions. The enslaved workers who had been brought to serve the event's logistical needs, more than 40 of them, drawn from different plantations across the region, gathered at the clearing's periphery in their own quiet groupings. They spoke little, but their eyes moved continuously, taking in the positions of the armed overseers, the layout of the clearing, the blocked channel exits, the general geometry of the situation. They understood without being told that this was not an ordinary fight. They had been passing Samuel's story between them for 3 years. They knew what was at stake in ways the planters in the center of the clearing could not fully imagine. At 2 o'clock, the fight was announced. Ajax was released from his chains and led to the ring. Samuel entered from the opposite side. For 30 seconds after the official start, neither man moved. They circled with the careful deliberateness of fighters who have each fought many times before and understand that the opening moments are not fighting, they are reading. Ajax probed with a testing jab. Samuel deflected and answered with a strike to the ribs that produced an audible impact and told both men things they needed to know. The fight that followed was the most extraordinary of Samuel's career, which is saying something that no combination of words can adequately convey. Both men fought with technique and power, and the particular desperation of people for whom losing means death. Ajax was everything Crane had spent 18 months and $2,000 acquiring. Samuel was 36 previous fights distilled into a single hour of absolute physical engagement. For 20 minutes, it was close in a way that none of Samuel's previous fights had been close. Ajax landed combinations that staggered Samuel visibly. He targeted the damaged left eye with consistent precision, reducing Samuel's vision on that side to shadows. He hammered the compromised ribs with blows that would have ended any fight in Samuel's history up to that moment. Samuel absorbed them and continued forward. Not because the damage wasn't real, it was. The medical assessment afterward would confirm 3 broken ribs, a fractured hand, a concussion and contusions spread across most of his body, but because he had developed over 3 years of this a relationship with pain that functioned differently than normal human physiology seemed to allow. He processed it as information rather than instruction. It told him what was happening. It did not tell him to stop. At the 25th minute, Samuel stopped defending. Not because he had run out of defensive options. He had simply made a calculation, in whatever part of his mind operated beneath conscious strategy, that the moment had arrived. He walked forward into Ajax's strikes with a directness that shocked the crowd out of its silence. He was absorbing blows that should have dropped him. He was landing responses that accumulated across Ajax's body with the systematic logic of a man completing a proof he had begun 36 fights earlier. The crowd went entirely silent, not the managed quiet of spectators performing respect for drama, the involuntary silence of people watching something that has exceeded every framework they brought with them. The fight lasted 33 minutes total. It ended when Samuel landed a final strike to Ajax's temple. The sound was the same sound that everyone who had attended these fights over 3 years had learned to recognize. the specific acoustics of something vital and irreversible happening to a human body. Ajax went rigid, then fell forward into the wet earth of the clearing's floor. The plantation doctor moved quickly to the ring, conducted his brief examination, and said what was already understood: dead at the scene. Samuel stood in the center of what had been the ring. His chest heaved with the effort of breathing through whatever his ribs had become. His left eye was sealed shut. His right hand hung at an angle that suggested the bones had reached some private agreement with each other that did not involve remaining in their original positions. Blood had mixed with sweat and the dark soil of the clearing until he looked, as one of the letters written afterward described it, like something that had grown up from the swamp rather than walked into it. After 37 fights, after 37 dead men, he was still standing. He turned to face the crowd. Several of the planters who met his eyes in that moment stepped back involuntarily for the third time in 3 years. The look on his face was not triumph, it was not anger, it was not the face of a man celebrating a victory. It was the face of a man who understood precisely what he had done and what it had cost and what it meant, and was not going to pretend, for anyone's comfort, that any of those things were different than they were. Talbot gave the signal. It was subtle, a small nod to the overseers positioned around the perimeter, the kind of gesture that could be missed if you weren't watching for it and couldn't be missed if you were. The overseers raised their rifles. They had clear sightlines to Samuel from 3 different angles. The plan was simple, quick, and designed to produce a result that the swamp would absorb and the official record would never acknowledge. What happened instead began with movement at the clearing's periphery. The 43 enslaved workers who had been brought to manage the logistics of the event stepped forward simultaneously, not one or two, all of them, from every part of the clearing's edge, moving with a quietness and a coordination that no one watching could have anticipated, because it had required no prior arrangement. It had required only shared understanding of a situation, shared knowledge of what was at stake, and shared recognition that this was the moment. They placed themselves between Samuel and the raised rifles, a human wall made of the bodies of people whose lives the law of Louisiana defined as property belonging to the men whose fingers were near the triggers, men and women who had every individual reason, every self-interested, self-preserving, rational reason to stay exactly where they were and let the plan proceed, who instead stepped forward into the geometry of the conspiracy and simply occupied the space it needed to function. They didn't speak, they didn't threaten, they didn't do anything that could be recorded as rebellion or resistance in the legal language of the time. They stood there and looked at the men with the guns. The overseers looked to Talbot. Talbot looked at the men around him, the planters who had been part of the conspiracy, now standing in a circle of sudden recalculation that was happening in real time across all of their faces simultaneously. The problem was arithmetic. Shooting Samuel meant shooting through people who were not Talbot's property. It meant destroying assets that belonged to the other planters present, men whose cooperation Talbot needed, whose business relationships he depended on, whose legal standing could be activated against him if he chose to destroy their property without authorization. It meant transforming a quiet elimination into a mass killing with 80 witnesses from the planter class and more than 40 from the enslaved community, all of whom would carry what they had seen into every conversation they had for the rest of their lives. But there was a calculation beneath the arithmetic that was more important, more threatening, more irreducible. Samuel had never been alone. Every fight over 3 years had been witnessed by enslaved people who carried the story back to their communities. Every victory had reinforced a proposition that the system could not afford to have its subjects believe, that a man could face the worst the system had, repeatedly, without flinching, and remain intact. Killing him now in front of 40 witnesses who would move freely through the information networks of the enslaved community for years afterward, risked creating something more dangerous than the living man had ever been. A martyr whose legend, freed from the constraints of a physical body that could be monitored and controlled, would travel to places Samuel himself could never reach. Marchand stepped forward. He positioned himself between the armed overseers and the wall of enslaved workers and addressed the crowd with a voice that carried across the clearing without effort. The fight is over. Samuel has won, according to rules we all agreed to. Anyone with a complaint about that outcome is welcome to pursue it through proper legal channels. Talbot's face darkened to a color that multiple witnesses later described using different words that meant the same thing. Crane shouted about fraud, about injustice, about the extraordinary sum he had invested in a fighter who had now failed him. Several other conspirators made their own protests with the specific character of men whose plan has failed, and who are now in the process of deciding how much of the failure to acknowledge publicly. But Marchand had something they could not overcome: 3 years of social capital built with the very men whose support he was now claiming. The planters who had profited most consistently from Samuel's victories, who had won significant money and built business relationships through their participation, now spoke up with the pragmatic solidarity of men protecting a system that had served them well. Changing the rules after the fact, they pointed out, would make future arrangements impossible. It would introduce a chaos that served no one's long-term interest. The entire enterprise depended on certain protocols being honored. Marchand's legal standing, however thin, as Samuel's owner, gave him rights that the assembled company was obligated to respect. Ignoring those rights would have consequences that extended beyond this particular afternoon. The rifles came down, slowly, with expressions that made the reluctance unambiguous. The crowd dispersed over the following hour, in clusters of men whose conversations were subdued, and whose expressions were occupied with the private calculations of people revising their understanding of a situation that had not resolved the way they expected. Some looked back at Samuel as they left, most did not. The enslaved workers moved efficiently to erase the evidence, collecting the ropes that had marked the ring, removing the wooden planks from the muddier sections, extinguishing the unlit torches that had been set but never needed. They worked quickly, understanding that every minute of delay increased the probability of an official investigation finding something worth pursuing. Within an hour, the clearing had begun returning to swamp in the way that Louisiana landscape always did, water seeping into vacated spaces, vegetation reclaiming what had been cleared, the patient wilderness resuming ownership of what human beings had temporarily borrowed. Marchand approached Samuel when the clearing had mostly emptied. "We need to leave," he said quietly, "now." Samuel nodded, but before he turned to go, he looked once more at the enslaved workers who had stepped forward, who were now scattered across the clearing in the process of departure, moving back toward the boats that would return them to their respective owners. His gaze moved from face to face, not quickly, with the specific attention of a man who is memorizing something he understands he may never see again in this form. Then he turned to Marchand, and he said the words that appear in the journal entry written that night in handwriting that shook despite every evident effort at control. 37 fights, 37 victories, 37 men dead because you and men like you decided we were property instead of people. I hope it was worth the money you made. There was no anger in it, no accusation designed to wound. It was said with the quiet finality of a man stating a fact for the record that official Louisiana would never keep, but that he intended to maintain through sheer act of speaking it aloud to the man who most needed to hear it. Marchand wrote that he felt something break inside him when he heard those words, some last defense, some final structure of rationalization he had maintained in order to continue being the person he had been for 3 years. It broke quietly and completely, like something that had been waiting for the right moment to acknowledge that it was no longer intact. They left the clearing together, and the relationship between them, which had been for 3 years, the relationship between owner and weapon, would never be the same thing again. The journey back through the swamp happened in silence. Marchand had Samuel taken to a cabin on the far edge of his property, isolated from the main house and the other enslaved workers. A doctor was brought in, one trusted to treat injuries without asking questions that would require answers. The assessment was thorough and grim: 3 broken ribs, a fractured hand, severe contusions across most of his body, a concussion that would require careful monitoring over the following weeks. But Samuel would survive, as he had always survived, as the system had tried 37 times to prevent. Marchand prepared the freedom papers within 2 weeks of the final fight. He brought them to the cabin himself, held them out with a gravity that the gesture deserved, and told Samuel that he was free, that the documentation was complete, the legal process honored as much as it could be honored in a state that had built its economy on the premise that such freedom was a privilege to be granted rather than a condition of being human. Samuel looked at the papers without taking them. "What about the others?" he asked. "Which others?" "Everyone else still enslaved on this plantation, everyone in this parish, everyone still living in the system that forced me to kill 37 men so that you could profit from it." Marchand had no answer for that. He stood in the cabin doorway holding the freedom papers and felt their inadequacy as a physical sensation. the weight of what they could not address pressing down on the weight of what they purported to offer. Freedom for one man, delivered by the hand of the man who had taken it from him, in the middle of a structure that continued operating as it had always operated. Finally, Samuel spoke again. "I'll stay, not as your property, those days are over, but I'll stay because there is work to do that cannot be done from somewhere else." "What work?" Samuel's answer was oblique in its language and completely unambiguous in its meaning. "The kind of work you learn to do when you spend 3 years watching powerful men gather in secret places and listening to them describe exactly how the world they control actually operates. The kind of work that takes patience and planning and knowledge that no free man living openly could have gathered. The kind of work that must be done carefully, over time, in ways that cannot be directly traced." Marchand understood in that moment, or understood as much as a man in his position could understand, which was imperfectly but genuinely, that Samuel had been conducting an operation for 3 years, that the fights had been, among other things, the means by which he had gathered the intelligence he needed. Names, relationships, financial arrangements, the geography of credit and influence and mutual obligation that constituted the real infrastructure of the plantation economy. He had been in the center of that infrastructure repeatedly, reliably for 3 years, and he had remembered everything. "That's dangerous," Marchand said, "if they find out what you're doing." "I'm not doing anything," Samuel said, with a perfect blandness that somehow managed to be simultaneously exact and complete. "I'm staying on your plantation and performing whatever work you assign me. If other people, through their own entirely independent choices, happen to find paths to freedom through channels that cannot be traced back to my involvement, that is simply the operation of good fortune in an unjust world." There was a long silence. Then Marchand said the words that would, in retrospect, represent the most consequential decision of his life. Consequential not in the way that his decision to purchase Samuel had been consequential, not in the language of profit and strategy and competitive advantage, but in the rarer and more demanding language of moral action taken by a man who has finally understood what he owes. He said, "What do you need from me?" "Nothing," Samuel said, "just continue treating me as you have been. The status creates cover, and don't ask questions about things you won't want to know the answers to." What followed over the next 3 years was documented incompletely, by design. The Marchand plantation became known, in the informal, careful language used by people who needed to communicate dangerous information without creating evidence, as a place where certain things were possible, where the paths out of enslavement, for those with the knowledge to navigate them, seemed less obstructed than elsewhere, where information arrived and resources appeared in ways that served specific purposes at specific moments. Manumissions were arranged through legal channels, Marchand's signature on the documents, the money paid, the paperwork filed. Enslaved workers were purchased by intermediaries who subsequently freed them, the money coming from sources that the official record listed as personal loans and business arrangements and various transactions that satisfied the formal requirements without revealing what they actually were. People disappeared occasionally, moving north through networks that somehow always had the right information available at the right time. Which roads were watched, which farmers would shelter travelers, which conductors on which routes had been cleared. Local authorities investigated 3 times. They found nothing prosecutable. Manumission was unusual but legal. Runaways occurred on every plantation. If some of Marchand's runaway enslaved people seemed to travel with unusual efficiency through territories where the geography was difficult and the authorities were generally effective, well, Louisiana was a large state, and coincidences accumulated. Through all of it, Samuel moved quietly around the Marchand plantation, performing whatever work he was assigned, speaking carefully with people who needed to be spoken to, passing along information that needed to pass. He was, by every official measure, an enslaved man with an unusual degree of personal privilege on a plantation managed by an eccentric owner. He was, by the measure of the families who would attribute their freedom to what happened in those years, something that no official record would ever fully capture. He was doing the work that 37 fights had made possible. He was turning the map he had built in those torchlit clearings, the map of names and relationships and vulnerabilities and pressure points, into action, one person at a time, one carefully managed arrangement at a time, with a patience and a precision that the system he was dismantling could not detect because it had never been designed to look for what he was doing. It had been designed to look for open rebellion, for violence, for the dramatic gestures of defiance that could be identified and crushed. It had never been designed to look for this, the quiet, methodical, essentially invisible work of a man who had spent 3 years learning exactly how the machine operated and was now, one small intervention at a time, introducing sand into its gears. Martian kept his promises to the individuals named in the original bargain with the thoroughness of a man who has finally found, too late and at too great a cost, the thing he actually values. Dinah received her freedom papers and $150, enough to establish herself in New Orleans as a seamstress, to marry, to start a family. She sent 2 letters over the following years confirming that she was safe and had found a life. The letters thanked Marchand, though the gratitude had the specific quality of thanks given because it is owed rather than because it resolves anything. Sealers received his papers and a letter of introduction to a free black community in Mobile. He was nearly 50, and freedom after decades of enslavement was complicated in ways that no document could address, but he adapted and lived until 1867. His grandchildren would tell stories about an ancestor who had known Samuel. Marcus, the boy who had been perhaps 10 years old when the bargain was first struck, who had followed Samuel around the stables with the devotion of a child who has found the person he intends to measure himself against, was apprenticed to a free black carpenter in Oplausers. He learned the trade and eventually built his own business and lived until 1903. He named his first son Samuel. He told his children the story the same way his grandmother had told it to him, not as legend exactly and not as history exactly, but as truth that had happened in the particular way that truths of that kind happen, through people who found in an impossible situation some impossible quality of survival and turned it, carefully and at great cost, into something that outlasted the situation. Samuel disappeared from the official record in early 1854. No death certificate was filed, no sale was documented, no manumission paper was recorded, no letter placed him in Louisiana or anywhere else after that year. He simply, in the language of official documentation, ceased to exist, which is to say that the system which had always defined him by its ownership of him stopped having the administrative need to note his presence, and the absence of that note became, in the archive, the only trace remaining. The oral histories are more generous. They disagree on the specifics, the geography of where he went, the exact sequence of his departure, whether he walked north through the same networks he had helped build or turned south toward the swamp settlements where Maroons had built communities beyond the reach of plantation authority, but they agree on the essential thing: he left. He left on his own terms. He left with the same calm certainty that had characterized everything he had done since the first night in that clearing in November 1847. Whatever freedom meant for a black man in America in 1854, he went to find it. Marchand lived until 1879, dying at 70. His obituary in the Oplausers newspaper was the kind of document that obituaries in that era were designed to be: a recitation of business accomplishments and civic standing that noted nothing inconvenient, named no one difficult, acknowledged no history that complicated the comfortable narrative of a successful man's successful life. He was remembered, such remembering as attended him, primarily for his business acumen and for his unexpected support of certain Reconstruction policies that provided limited rights to formerly enslaved people, positions his contemporaries regarded as eccentric and that his family preferred not to discuss at length. But among his effects, his family found a letter, dated April 15, 1865, the day after Abraham Lincoln was shot, the morning after the last night that the world Marchand had built his life within could pretend it would continue as it had, written in handwriting that wavered between careful control and something beyond control, addressed to no one, signed by no one. The letter said, in part, "I have lived with the knowledge of what I did for 24 years. I forced a man to kill 37 others for my profit and my entertainment. I told myself I was protecting him, providing him with privileges, honoring my half of a bargain. The truth is simpler and worse. I was using him, exploiting the one thing he had left, his strength and his will to protect others. The fact that he survived, that he managed to transcend what I tried to make him into, is no credit to me. It is a testament to something in him that I never understood and never will. If there is a God, and if that God keeps accounts, then I will answer for those 37 deaths and for every other thing I did in the name of profit. I do not expect forgiveness. I do not deserve it. I can only hope that the small actions I took in later years, the freedoms arranged, the money provided, the support given to Reconstruction might count for something in the final accounting, but I doubt they will. Some debts cannot be paid." The letter was found by his grandson. The family deliberated about destroying it. They decided finally to preserve it. It would eventually be donated to a historical archive at Louisiana State University, where it remains available to researchers willing to know what it contains. In 1932, a Federal Writers Project researcher named Elizabeth Hartwell interviewed a woman named Sarah Desmond in New Orleans. Sarah was 93 years old and had lived long enough to carry within herself the span of time between the antebellum world and the Depression era present as a single continuous personal memory. Her grandmother had been enslaved on a plantation near Oplausas in the 1840s and 1850s. The interview is preserved in the Library of Congress archives. In it, Sarah describes what her grandmother told her about a man who fought for white men's entertainment and never let them break his spirit. She says her grandmother called him the strongest person she had ever known, not because of his body, but because of his mind. She says that when the war came and the legal freedom it brought arrived in Louisiana, there were dozens of people throughout St. Landry Parish who credited this man with having helped them survive to see that day, who credited him not with dramatic rescue or open rebellion, but with the specific, patient, invisible work of making possible what the system had been constructed to make impossible. When Hartwell asked whether Sarah's grandmother had known Samuel personally, the answer was deliberately imprecise. She knew him well enough to understand what he represented. That was all anyone needed to know. In 1968, at the height of the civil rights movement, a young activist named Marcus Johnson, named after the boy who had followed Samuel around the stables in another century, wrote an essay about the legend for a Black history publication. His conclusion has not been improved upon in the 58 years since. We may never know every detail of Samuel's life, or even whether all the stories told about him are strictly factual. But what we know for certain is this: in one of the darkest periods of American history, enslaved people found ways to resist, to maintain their humanity, to protect each other, and ultimately to survive long enough to see freedom arrive. Samuel's story, whether literal history or symbolic truth, represents all those countless acts of resistance and survival. That makes it true in the ways that matter most. The clearing on the edge of the Atchafalaya Basin was reclaimed by the swamp within years of March 17, 1851. Water rose, vegetation moved in, and within a decade no physical trace remained of what had happened there. The swamp erased the evidence the way it erased everything eventually, not through violence but through patient, inevitable reclamation. A thoroughness that made no distinction between what deserved to be preserved and what deserved to be forgotten. But the memory persisted, carried in the mouths of descendants across 6 generations, passed in quiet rooms between grandparents and grandchildren who understood the weight of what was being handed to them, maintained through the specific mechanism by which communities that have been systematically excluded from official history preserve their own, through voice, through repetition, through the refusal to allow the absence of a paper record to mean the absence of a truth. Whether Samuel lived to see the end of slavery, whether he survived to 1865 and the legal transformation of the world that had forced him into those rings, the historical record does not say. The official documentation stopped in 1854 and did not resume. He existed in the archive as property until he didn't. That is all the archive offers. But the stories offer something different. They offer a man who fought 37 times and won 37 times, not because violence was his nature or his choice, but because the system he was trapped within gave him no alternative to fighting except to watch the people he loved be destroyed. They offer a man who took the impossible position he had been forced into and found within it, a way to act with intelligence and patience and profound moral seriousness. Who understood long before the men around him that the fights were not the point. The fights were the means. The point was the map, the knowledge, the relationships, the carefully built architecture of resistance that could be assembled in the dark because the men with the power to stop it had made the fundamental error of believing that the man they thought they owned was not paying attention. He was paying attention to every word. The 37 men who died in those clearings deserve to be named, and the limitations of the surviving record make that impossible. Jupiter, Cato, Caesar, Ajax, the others whose names the documents either never recorded or recorded and then lost. They were not enemies, they were not obstacles. They were men in the same impossible position, forced into the same impossible choice, who happened to draw the worst outcome of the encounter. Their deaths were the price of an economy that treated human beings as expendable capital, and the responsibility for those deaths belongs not to the men who threw the punches, but to the men who arranged the fights and profited from the results. Marchand understood this eventually. His letter says so in the shaking handwriting of a man who arrived at moral clarity 24 years too late and at too high a cost to call it redemption. He understood it, and he carried it for the rest of his life as the weight that it deserved to be. Samuel understood it from the beginning, and he chose, within the constraints of a situation that offered no clean options, to turn that horror into the most sophisticated act of resistance that Louisiana's plantation country had ever seen, to use the knowledge gathered in those torchlit clearings, one careful step at a time, to chip away at the system that had put him in them. This is what Hollow Century exists to recover, not the comfortable narratives, not the history that makes the present feel inevitable or the past feel distant. The actual history, the complicated, costly, sometimes morally crushing history of what people did when the world offered them nothing but impossible choices. The history of how resistance actually worked, not in dramatic gestures, but in patience, in intelligence, in the long game played by people who understood that the system they were opposing had been built to outlast any individual act of defiance, and that the only way to defeat it was to be more patient than it was. Samuel was more patient. Samuel was more intelligent. Samuel, in the end, was more free in the way that freedom actually means something than any of the men who thought they owned him. That is where the official record ends. The truth, as always, is larger. You've just watched something that most history classes will never teach. The story of Samuel, the man they called the Bayou Giant, is real in every way that matters, in the documented fragments that survived, in the oral traditions that carried it across 6 generations, and in the truth it represents about how enslaved people resisted, endured, and ultimately outlasted a system built to be permanent. This is Hollow Century, where forgotten darkness lives. If this video changed how you understand something, leave a comment below. Tell us where you're watching from, tell us what hit hardest, tell us what you want us to uncover next. Every comment helps more people find these stories. Subscribe if you haven't. Share this with someone who needs to hear it. The history they didn't teach you is exactly the history you need. We'll see you in the next one.